Hey, what's up guys? Welcome back to another video. My name is Javier, and if you're new to the channel is all about wedding filmmaking, business tips, and life experiences. Now today I'm going to be talking about the Sony FX3 versus the Canon C70. I've had the Canon C70 for over 3.5 years. I've shot at least 300 weddings with it, and it's been my main workhorse for weddings. Now the Sony FX3, I recently picked it up back in May. If you watched the video, you know I picked it up because my second shooter went ahead and decided to invest into Sony. And well, the power of influence got me to purchase one, and I actually liked it and I bought another one. So now let's talk about these two cameras head to head for the features I look for wedding filmmaking. Now, the first feature about the C70 that I love is gonna be its internal ND filters. We all know the hassle of switching lenses and then having to switch ND filters at the same time. And especially when we're in a run and gun situation, you're losing time and you're missing shots. Having those internal NDs is a lifesaver, and for the most part, you never want to go back, but I've learned how to use them all over again with the Sony FX3, and it's not as bad. Now, internal RAW is a big selling point for me for the C70 because I think that's the feature all of us filmmakers want, is internal RAW. Really be able to manipulate the colors in post, the white balance, ISO, all those different features. And having that just built right into the camera is a great thing. We all know it didn't come with it right out the box, but Canon gave us an update for free and allowed us to have internal RAW up to 60 frames per second, which is incredible. I'm actually filming in RAW right now for this episode. So if you like the colors, I mean, it's not just the RAW, but it's also the lighting scene, anamorphic lenses we're using, and the other stuff. Now, the next thing I love about the Canon C70 is the batteries. The battery life on this camera is insane. For weddings, I go through 2 batteries per camera. So most of my weddings are 10-hour weddings. Now, the way I shoot allows me to just use 2 batteries. But some of my friends tend to use 3 batteries because maybe they're overshooters, but the way I shoot, I just use 2 of those batteries and it lasts me all day. And I can also run V-mount if I want to, but I tend not to because I want a lighter setup. But when I do use V-mount, it's for my monitor more often than not. But the internal battery is awesome in itself. The next thing is gonna be Timecode. Timecode has become an essential part of my workflow. So both of these cameras are running tentacle syncs right now directly into the Timecode port, and it just allows me to sync up this audio and make this whole process so much easier. And I'm gonna make a dedicated video on Timecode and how you should be using it for your weddings and workflow, especially if you're using more than 3 cameras. If you're using 3 to 4 cameras, Timecode is gonna be a lifesaver in post and in editing, and honestly, it's gonna allow you to be much more profitable at the end of the day and add a whole bunch of other stuff. But besides that, those are the 4 features I look into the Canon C70 that are essential for me, why I love this camera, why I think you should consider just buying one at this stage. You can find them at much better price points in 2024 than you did back in 2020 when they first came out. Now let's talk about the FX3. FX3, the main feature I love about it is the 12,800 ISO. I think a lot of people talk about this feature in a way that, you know, it's the cleanest image ever at 12,800. And I'm like, yes, it is, but it doesn't mean you should be shooting at 12,800 the whole time. What you want to be using this feature for is to be more flexible in the different frame rates you want to shoot in, to be much more creative. So if you're shooting reception and if you don't have any lights with you, or it's completely dark or whatever, you can switch over to 12,800. And if you want to shoot 120 frames per second, now you can. And it gives you that flexibility in post to be creative with your footage. So you can get ultra slow motion, or you can shoot in 60 or in 23 and still have a usable image that you can put into the edit. That's the thing about 12,800 that's extremely useful. Personally, I try to keep the ISO on the FX3 at 800 because it gives you just the cleanest image, and I tend to shoot in flexible ISO rather than Cine EI now, just because if you understand ISO, it also affects your dynamic range, and depending where you're at or your setting in scene, you can get the most dynamic range for that scene in particularly. So that's why I love the 12,800 ISO on this camera. It's been game changer and it's allowed me to get way better reception footage now and be more creative in the edit, where I feel like a lot of creators always slack on is the reception portion of the edit. And you let me know, you be the judge. You guys are seeing B-roll of the reception footage. The next feature I love about the Sony FX3 is the internal IBIS. IBIS has been, I won't say a game changer, but has been very useful. The C70 doesn't have IBIS, but it's a heavier camera. It's a much bigger camera. And when you have a lens attached, you know, you don't have those micro jitters like you do with a smaller package using the Sony FX3. Having IBIS allows me to shoot prime now, which something I never did with the C70, but with this camera I can, and get away with it pretty well at shooting at 23. Or even I've used an 85mm and shot a first look reception with it, and that was pretty awesome to have in such a small package, not having to bring a monopod or another tripod. So IBIS is definitely useful for those situations, if you especially want to shoot on primes all day long. I usually tend to turn it off when I'm using a gimbal and when I am going crazy with, you know, the hand movements and stuff like that for reception time. And the reason why is because you get the warp effect, and you definitely don't want to have that in your footage. So I just turned it off, but you got 3 options. You can go ahead, turn it off. You can go steady shot or steady shot active, which punches in, but you want to be mindful not to move around or pan when using that mode. It's more like a tripod mode. So just use it carefully. But that's been a key feature that I've enjoyed using with the FX3. The next feature has to be its color science. Sony has improved in their color science dramatically since I've last time used it back in 2020. I had the Sony A7 III. I hated that camera because the colors are just awful. We had 8-bit, and we had tons of banding in the sky, and it was just did not produce a clean image. Having 10-bit was absolutely necessary for me. I jumped to Fuji, jumped to C70. Now I got the FX3 back, and the color science on this camera has been impressive. Obviously we know that the creator was made using this camera, and that's been like, wow, like Hollywood decided to use the Sony FX3 for a movie called The Creator, which is a sane, they could have used an ARRI Alexa if they wanted, or ARRI Mini, they could have spent their budget on a $75,000 camera with all the lenses and everything, but they decided to use the Sony FX3, and its color science in that movie was actually pretty incredible. So with that being said, like, I can't argue with that anymore. They've absolutely improved their color science, and the colors on it are insane. You guys are seeing the footage right now with it. I've enjoyed it. I still kind of prefer the color science of the C70, but ultimately the FX3 just gives you a different look, and I appreciate that look, and I've come to love it too in its own right. And the fourth and final feature I love about the Sony FX3, that thing is absolutely important. It's not even just the FX3, but it's the Sony lineup, what they're doing. If you're a beginning videographer and you want to get into videography, Canon doesn't really give you a route to do that. The Sony FX3, or Sony in general, does, and you got several options. You can start off with the Sony FX30. I think now they just came out with the Sony EV2, which uses the same sensor as the FX30, but at a $1,000 price point compared to Canon. What can you find with Canon to do that? R6 Mark II, spending $2,500, like that's a $1,500 difference plus lenses, and that adds up extremely quickly. And so Sony is just the brand now that's allowing you to get into video at an affordable price point with a great image and great features. And then FX30, you can graduate to the FX3, and then FX6, then FX9, and then lastly Sony Burano, and then the Venice series. And Sony has allowed creators to start creating and using their tools. And also when it comes to lens selections, you have so many lens selections from Tamron, Sigma, Rokinon. Obviously you got cinema glass that you can use, but the barrier entry in lenses is also much more affordable with great quality compared to Canon, which you got to spend an arm and leg for those RF glass. And we know that they're releasing Sigma lenses now, but it's only for their APS-C. I mean, I could take advantage of it for the C70, but ultimately in terms of full frame lenses, that is not there. Final conclusion for this, my, I guess, weapon of choice, I would say, for weddings, it's gonna be, or to film on, I'm talking about filming, is the Sony FX3. It's just a better camera for weddings. It's smaller. The color science is great. I got myself accustomed to using internal or ND filters, variable NDs, throughout a wedding day, and it's just less intimidating too as well for a couple and for guests if they're not used to having cameras, compared to the C70, which is much bigger, and depending how you rig it out or even put it on a gimbal, it's just much tougher. And ultimately, autofocus is just way much better on the Sony FX3. And I think it's a better camera for weddings in particularly. You can still do timecode. You can still use XLRs if you want to. You can rig it up in so many different ways that it's up to you how you want to use the tool itself. But ultimately, I think it's a better tool in 2024 using the FX3 over the Canon C70 for weddings. But again, it just depends on your style. I typically go handheld and I go gimbal. So I do a little bit of both. Depends on the story I'm trying to tell and portray. But now I'm finding the best tool for that is the Sony FX3 that can do both extremely well compared to the C70 where it still lacks an autofocus. The size of it is nice and I'm going to be keeping these cameras for other projects. But for weddings, it's not going to be the main cameras for weddings and using as my A and B cameras, but they'll still be my C and D cameras, so I'm not getting rid of them. But that's my conclusion for the Sony versus C70. You guys decide which tool is going to be better for you, but this is my perspective. And just let me know down in the comments. I'll see you guys on the next one. Peace.